This presentation is part one, and we're going to be demonstrating that it is scientifically impossible for natural causes alone to create life. If this is true, then your life is not some random accident of nature, and there is, therefore, a supernatural creator. 20 years ago, four of my friends and I wrote, and we paid for an advertisement in a local paper. And we outlined in this, Your Life is Not an Accident, the scientific reasons why life is not some random accident. Predictably, it generated a little controversy, and the newspaper interviewed professors at a local California university who did not really address the scientific issues we raise, but instead focused on making remarks that were demeaning about us. These people are basically the modern equivalent of the Flat Earth Society, and its evolution and creation is religion versus science. And it's as un-American as anything could be, the professor said. So it is typically framed when we get into these issues of creation that it's science and reason versus religion and superstition. And the reality is that it is scientific claims versus other scientific claims. We have the same Earth, the same fossils, the identical evidence. And we're not talking about events that we can see in the present. We're talking about past events that are not repeatable and are not observable. Now, one of the observations is when we talk about science that science has not always existed in mankind's history. And I'm talking about the testing and repeatable experiments. Most historians of science recognize that a new type of science, modern science that we use today, was born in Europe during the 16th to the 18th century. And it was primarily influenced by people who held a very strong Christian worldview. Now, around 300 BC with Aristotle, there was observation and reason. He would observe the sun rising and setting, and then he would reason that the Earth is the center of the solar system. And so that was the observation and reason. The scientific revolution didn't begin until about 2,000 years later, around 1600 AD. And it's pretty much what we use in schools today in their science projects. You ask a question, develop a hypothesis. What do you believe is the answer? And you test it with repeatable experiments. That's the most important part. And so this was not born until 2,000 years later. What was the reason for this? And the reason for this 2,000-year-old stagnation was consensus, the authority of teaching. Now, Michael Crichton, who is a physician and screenwriter, and he also wrote Jurassic Park, has said some very accurate points. He said, let's be clear, the work of science has nothing whatever to do with consensus. Consensus is the business of politics. Science, on the contrary, requires only one investigator who happens to be right, which means that he or she has results that are verifiable by reference to the real world. So it's not based upon science, it's based upon truth and coming up with the right information. Now, this 2,000-year impact began with Aristotle. And I'm not blaming him. He lived 300 BC and was trying to figure it out. He believed in many gods. He was wrong on so many accounts. So the progress wasn't his fault. It was the idea of being accurate and the consensus. His first mistake that lasted for 2,000 years is he believed the world was not created but has existed from eternity. And if you look at wikipedia.org, in the 1930s, it says almost every cosmologist or astronomer preferred an eternal steady state model. That means the universe has existed forever. As the beginning of a new universe, beginning of time, implied by the Big Bang, imported religious concepts. In other words, a lot of the cosmologists preferred the eternal state because it's too much like Genesis that the world came into existence. In 1980, there was PBS popular Cosmos series, and Carl Sagan was famous for saying, "The cosmos is all that is or ever was or ever will be." He was arguing for the universe has always existed. Now, Sagan was an agnostic, and his statement appears to be a mimic of Revelation 1:8's description of God, that God is who is and who always was and who is to come. Sagan's statement is an example of an unsubstantiated philosophical statement made as if they are truth and scientific. And so we have to be careful whenever we hear statements even made today. Many of them are philosophical, they're unsubstantiated, but they're trying to be made as though they're truthful and accurate and scientific. It wasn't until the 1990s that the Big Bang Theory dominated. And the Big Bang Theory concluded, and that's the consensus today, and it happened because of the launch of the Hubble telescope and the data that we obtained from the satellites, that the universe at one time did not exist and it had a beginning, just as Genesis 1 had indicated. Now, the second mistake that Aristotle made that lasted for almost 2,000 years was the Earth was the center of the solar system. And a mathematician and astronomer 400 and 500 years later, Ptolemy, affirmed that. And it wasn't until Copernicus in 1532 first suggested that the sun was the center. It wasn't controversial until Galileo confirmed that in 1615 AD. Now, textbooks and our culture describe this discovery of Galileo as science versus religion. In fact, here's a biology high school textbook, Patterns and Process of Life, and 2004. And if there's a section on page 99 in discussing belief in creation, and here's what this textbook is telling our children. Until the 1500s, many Europeans believed the earth was flat. Adventurous sailors like Columbus and Magellan and the work of astronomers like Copernicus and Galileo caused considerable controversy at the time, and some scientists were executed for teaching the earth and the other planets orbited the sun. Can you imagine living in a time when scientific curiosity was so discouraged or even forbidden? Now, the facts of this statement are just the opposite. The facts are, it's not true most Europeans believed the earth was flat in 1500s. It began with the Babylonians through the ancient Egyptians. However, the early Greeks got it right as far back as 400 BC. It was Washington Irving's fiction of Journeys of Columbus that had a lot to do with convincing the world that they believed it was flat. If you go to also in Wikipedia.org, no scientists were executed for their beliefs that the earth rotated around the sun. And what we found, it was the scientists of Aristotle that prevailed upon the Pope to silence Galileo and place him under house arrest. So none were executed as indicated in the textbook. If you go to wikipedia.org, there's the myth of the flat earth. There was scarcely a Christian scholar of the Middle Ages who did not acknowledge the earth's being round's veracity and even know the approximate circumference around the earth. Then the Wikipedia goes on to say the flat earth flourished most between 1870 and 1920 and had to do with the ideological setting created by struggles over evolution. Went on to say atheists and agnostics championed the conflict to prove that science and religion are locked into an eternal conflict. So 100 years later, we still see this in 2004, the flat earth myth being used in creation, as it was against me in a 1995 newspaper. They're kind of like saying, look, you creationists, you got it wrong saying that the earth was flat, so don't get it wrong now about evolution. And nothing could be further from the truth. So the real conflict was the outdated science of Aristotle versus the new science of Copernicus and Galileo. And the church had wrongly aligned itself with the prevailing scientific consensus. Before moving on, I want to address this last claim, where at the very bottom of that textbook, can you imagine living in a time when scientific curiosity was so discouraged or even forbidden? I want to address this because our culture repeatedly represents Christianity as a hindrance to science and even education. When it comes to doubts and questions and re-examination, Christianity stands alone above all other worldviews, including atheists, in encouraging one to open their mind and question. Why? Because truth claims can withstand being questioned. Regarding education, the first universities were created by followers of Christ, by Christians in Italy. Oxford and England, the Lord is my light was their motto. University of Paris, Cambridge followed, and then the Protestant Reformation, and there were universities in Naples and Vienna and Geneva. In America, the very first university was Harvard to teach pastors. Yale followed, also founded by Christians. In fact, 92% of the first colleges and universities founded in America were by Christians. Robert Rake is famous for the founder of Sunday school. And this was not for children of the church, but it was for children who were not getting an education, as they were working along with their parents 6 days a week, and Sunday was their only day off. So by 1830, over 1.5 million children were being taught by 160,000 volunteers to improve their education. The emphasis of education is shown in this map of the adult literacy rate of the world in 1900. That's about 115 years ago. The countries in green average over a 90% literacy rate, the ability to read and write. The U.S., Canada, and Western Europe were impacted by the spread of Christianity and the emphasis on education. By contrast, the majority of the rest of the world could not read or write. As I said previously, there was about a 2,000-year gap between Aristotle and the scientific revolution. Besides consensus, there were a couple of important events. First of all, in 1450 AD, the Gutenberg printing press was invented and the Gutenberg Bible was printed. And then Martin Luther in 1517 started the Protestant Reformation. And that caused the printing of the Tyndale, Geneva, King James Bible, and the spread of universities. Now, if we look at the fathers of science, Johannes Kepler, Robert Boyle, these are all the fathers of the various branches of science. They were devout Christians. Johannes Kepler stated that we should think God's thoughts. Isaac Newton has been voted the greatest scientist of all time. John Ray defined species. Carl von Linnaeus was the first to do the scientific classifications. In fact, these people were just not nominal Christians, they were devout. This is writings of Isaac Newton. He wrote more about the Bible than he did about science. Here's John Ray's work, The Wisdom of God, the Works of the Creation. The list continues as we go through time. Matthew Mallory, oceanography, we'll get into that. Louis Pasteur, James Maxwell, Gregory Mendel in genetics, Joseph Lister, where we get Listerine in antiseptic surgery. We go on with Samuel Morse, Lord Kelvin, thermodynamics, and it continues. So notice John Fleming was also a minister, the inventor of the vacuum tube. Matthew Mallory is credited with being the father of oceanography, and he charted the various currents that flow all over the world. He got the idea that there might be currents from Psalms 8:8, talking about paths of the sea, and that verse is on his tombstone. And in a monument to him in Richmond, Virginia, you'll see that in this statue on the right, there's a pencil and a compass and sea charts, and the architect also put in a Bible. Now, I'm not saying other cultures didn't contribute to advances in science. There was Al-Hazen about 1000 AD who wrote about optics and mathematics. But other cultures did not discover the law of motion, the laws of gravity, the laws of thermodynamics, these modern laws that we use and embody as what we call modern science. In other words, where's the Greek version of Newton? Where's the Muslim version of Kepler? Where's the Hindu version of Boyle in chemistry? Where's the Buddhist version of Mendel and his study of genetics? Actually, as we go back, atheism and other religious cultural beliefs actually prevented the advancement of what is known as modern science. They believed that the universe was eternal, necessary, cyclical, and evolutionary. It followed from reason and observation, and not from testing and repeatable experiments. Yes, these previous cultures would mark the positions of stars and come up with calendars, but it was more record keeping, but not trying to understand how nature works. And the belief in the cyclical nature of the universe was shared by the Egyptians and Babylonians and Hindus and Chinese and many others. And they were not interested in the cause and effects between events, but the manifestations, in essence, of nature, whose order mattered very little to them. But Christianity changed the view of nature. There was the belief in one God who created everything, not multiple pagan gods who were seen as a part of nature. And that this God was a lawgiver who willed moral laws, but also laws of nature, which they studied and tried to understand. And the God of Christianity was rational, and so searching in the creation would not be in vain. It would not be, it's not an illusion. God also, they believe, created out of nothing. So the universe had a beginning, and therefore there was a reason for the universe existence as well of that as of mankind. And finally, the early Christian scientists were searching for and finding the objective truth about the world. And their moral code required truthful reporting and honest experiments. James Maxwell, a British scientist, 1865, discovered and wrote about the electric and magnetic waves through space. It gave us the radio and further discoveries. In 2000, he was voted the third greatest physicist behind Isaac Newton and Albert Einstein. Einstein said that his work was the most profound in physics since Isaac Newton, and that was 200 years earlier. He wrote this letter to a friend, and it just shows his heart as a scientist. Now my great plan, which was conceived of old, is to let nothing be willfully left unexamined. In other words, nothing to be holy ground consecrated to stationary faith, whether positive or negative. In other words, it's open to the possibility of being wrong about his faith even. Never hide anything, be it weed or no, nor seem to wish it hidden. Now I am convinced that no one but a Christian can actually purge his land of these holy spots, get rid of these prior beliefs and superstitions. Contrast that third greatest scientist of all time with the idea of Richard Lewontin, an atheist and Harvard evolutionary biologist. We take the side of science in spite of the patent absurdity of some of its constructs, and in spite of its failure to fulfill many extravagant promises of health and of life, in spite of a tolerance of the scientific community for unsubstantiated just so stories, because we have a prior commitment, a commitment to materialism, atheism. So he's not open to being wrong about his faith. And he goes on to say in the interview, we take this position because we cannot let a divine foot in the door. He cannot let a competing worldview enter with great debate. So let's move on to the third item that Aristotle believed in, and there was a 2,000-year consensus of it. And he believed that life rose from non-living things, otherwise known as spontaneous generation. He stated, based upon observation and reason, it was a readily observable truth that plant life arose from the dew that falls on the plant, that flies basically come from putrid matter, and mice from dirty hay. In 1639, 2,000 years later, Jean van Helmont, a chemist and physician, stated, if a soiled shirt is placed in a vessel containing grains of wheat, the leaven in the shirt with fumes from the wheat will within 21 days transform the wheat into mice. So 2,000 years later, they believe that mice come from spontaneously being generated from time, wheat, and a dirty shirt. Other examples of the belief during these 2,000-year period is frogs came from mud and maggots existed from meat. There were two scientific experiments that ended the debate about spontaneous generation. One was a devout Christian by the name of Francis Redeye, and he proved that maggots didn't come from meat, but the eggs of flies. And in his experiment, he sealed a piece of meat on the right, and flies were not able to plant their eggs, and so there was no maggots that spontaneously generated. Now, it persisted even 75 years later. While Reddy's experiment disproved larger animals, the common belief there were still small organisms that were coming to life. And this biologist, John Needham, said in 1747, there is a life force causing life. And they would notice that when they boiled a broth mixture of soup, let it cool, and then sealed, the mixture would become cloudy as though life was coming from it. Now, there's been fewer people who have saved more lives than Louis Pasteur. The vaccines that he developed protected millions, according to the BBC. In 1862, he developed the germ theory, the spoilage of food and milk due to decay caused by microbes. And Pasteur is famous for the heating of liquids called pasteurization. And he developed vaccines for rabies, and he helped Joseph Lister develop anesthetic surgery. He was a French national hero, probably best known for preventing not only spoilage of milk, but also the wine and the wine industry. And just to give it a little historical note, his experiments came out just 3 years after Charles Darwin published his book, Origin of the Species, which does not address the origin of life or spontaneous generation. But basically what Louis Pasteur's test was, he boiled 2 broths, and one remained free, the second one there, and so the curved neck was removed, and it prevented dust from falling in that had microbes. And so it remained free from the microorganisms. The curved neck on the other one was broken off, and dust could fall in, and microbes were able to grow. So Louis Pasteur, when he received the award from the French Academy of Science, said, "Never will the doctrine of spontaneous generation recover from the mortal blow of this simple experiment. There is no known circumstance in which it can be confirmed that microscopic beings came into the world without germs, without parents similar to themselves. In other words, life comes from life." Now, this caused some problems with Darwin. He wrote a letter to Ernest Haeckel, and in the letter he said, "Thank you for spreading my doctrine of evolution." And then he said, "I much wish that this latter question, referring to spontaneous generation, could be settled, but I see no prospect of it. If it could be proved, if we could prove spontaneous generation, this would be most important to us." Us meaning the spread of evolution. Now, Ernst Haeckel, who is famous for the false embryo drawings that still appear in many biology textbooks today, said, "If we do not accept the hypothesis of spontaneous generation, that at one point in the history of evolution, we must have some other recourse to the miracle of supernatural creation." But despite this, here is George Wald, Nobel Prize Harvard professor. He acknowledges that it is basically a religious belief on their part. When it comes to the origin of life, there are only 2 possibilities: creation or spontaneous generation. There is no third way. Spontaneous generation was disproved 100 years ago, but that leads us to only one other conclusion, that of supernatural creation. We cannot accept that on, notice this, not scientific reasons, not the evidence, but our religious belief, our philosophical grounds. Therefore, we choose to believe the impossible, that life arose spontaneously by chance. There's a book out, I'm sorry, I don't have enough faith to be an atheist, and this is some of the things that we are talking about. Nevertheless, today, spontaneous generation is still being promoted for the origin of life. Methane, ammonia, elements on the early Earth. Some have lightning coming in. Others have heated water. And the latest is space dust from outer space. But the point is, whether we're talking about the generation of mice from a dirty shirt or today's version, both are just as ridiculous. And the undisputed facts are, spontaneous generation has never been observed to happen in nature. No life form has ever been created through controlled experiments. The law of biogenesis, that life can only come from existing life, is true, it's universal, it's absolute, and there are no known exceptions to it. With that journey of the history of some of the scientific issues, let's move to today and discuss the topic of origins. There are the big three. How did the universe begin? How did life first appear? How did different things, living things appear, otherwise known as evolution? Every person has some belief about how these three began in their individual worldview, and there are only two basic choices. One is naturalism, that physical and natural processes alone can explain everything. The other is supernatural. Matter, life, the laws of nature came from a creator. Now we hear this word chance, random, coincidence, is used a lot in our culture today. These are direct quotes in our media and publications. Evolution is a series of chance occurrences. An animal is an accident of nature, a collection of chance mutations. Chance alone is the source of every innovation, Jacques Monod, Nobel Prize winner, said in his book Chance and Necessity. And random chance is taught as a fact, as the cause of the universe, the origin of life, and the complexity of life. Turn on TV, go to a museum, read a newspaper, and you're bombarded with the assumption that chance exists as some sort of force of nature. The reality is chance is an empty word. It is nothing. It is only the mathematical probability of something occurring. It is not a biological force. It doesn't cause or make anything to happen. Self-creation through chance is absurd. It's a myth. It is imaginary hocus pocus. It is contrary to every law of science, every principle of logic, and sheer common sense. The chance of rolling a 7 with these two dice is 1 out of 6. It's a mathematical probability. The chance of rolling snake eyes is 1 out of 36. But what is the chance of rolling a 13? It's 0, because the ability to roll a 13 is not present in two dice with 1 through 6. What if you rolled for 1,000,000 years? You would still not get a 13 because the ability is not there. Chance is, there's a word called causation, and that's the act or process of causing something to happen. That's a Merriam-Webster dictionary. Whenever we go into jury instructions, it's an act causing an injury, and if the injury is the direct, natural, and probable consequence of the act. So chance is not an act. That is why you need to know about DNA, mutations, and natural selection. This is the core issue. It doesn't happen by chance. This is the mechanism that is supposed to have godlike creative abilities. It is rephrased usually this way. Now, this is the primary premise of the naturalistic explanation, is that man, humankind, is merely the product of random mutations plus natural selection. We got to know what that means. This premise is not testable, and it's basically accepted by faith. Now, there's a book out about 2 years ago in 2013, Manual for Creating Atheists. The goal is to help Christians abandon faith and embrace reason. And he makes this point: in the last 2,400 years of intellectual history, not a single argument for the existence of God has withstood scrutiny. That is quite a claim. Now, to be an atheist, you have to be certain about three major things. You have to be certain of the origin of the universe by natural causes. In other words, what caused the universe to go from this, nothing, to this, a universe of matter and stars and planets. If you look at National Geographic Origin of the Universe website, they indicate that scientists believe the entire vastness of the observable universe, including all the matter and radiation, was compressed into a hot, dense mass just a few millimeters across. That is, all of that we see in the universe was compressed into the size of a pebble. They go on to say the Big Bang Theory leaves several major questions unanswered. One is the original cause of the Big Bang in the first place. Several answers have been proposed to address this fundamental question, but none have ever been proven. And even adequate testing has proven to be a formidable challenge. So the origin of the universe by natural process has a lot of uncertainty. Nobody's certain how it took place. The second question is, an atheist has to be certain the origin of life arose from non-living things. In other words, what caused an existence of the earth of no life to one day produce life? In June of 2011, a challenge was sent out by the Origin of Life Project to researchers around the world, offering $50,000 for the best proposal to explain the origin of life on Earth. They still don't know. And one of the reasons for that is the law of biogenesis, is that life only comes from life. There are no known exceptions, and this is based upon observational science. Now, in all of the history, and an atheist also has to have faith that it happened once in the distant past, although they don't know how. Now, I have done a lot of research to find if there was any occurrence in recorded history of life coming from non-life. I found two. One was Pinocchio and the other was Frosty the Snowman. Of course, these are fairy tales. But nevertheless, we're bombarded with this occurred. This is a photo suggests water might have been on Mars, and so life might have existed. And this is probably the most ridiculous. It says at the most basic science level from Science News is all you need is rocks and water, and everything else happens by itself. There's no magic here in the origin of life. Are you kidding me? And then we found in CNN when NASA had its first color pictures from Mars, he actually said this, the TV news analyst, and we all know if there is water, there are fish. In other words, if you have water, then the origin of life through fish is quite evident. The third thing an atheist has to be certain about is evolution has godlike creative abilities. Nature, in October of 2014, a major science publication in England, had this article, Does Evolutionary Theory Need a Rethink? The answer, according to all of these authors, was yes, and urgently. The article went on to interview other scientists, and they found that many were reluctant to express their criticism about evolution. The reason why? It evoked an emotional, even hostile reaction from their peers, and they also feared they would receive less funding and recognition in their field. Now, before discussing evolution, it's important to know what we're talking about, because there's two types of evolution. We're not talking about change over time. Everybody agrees that happens to some degree. And we're not talking about variation within kinds, otherwise known as microevolution. You can take two dogs and produce a large variety of dogs, but they remain dogs. The same is true for horses or most any other kind of animal. The type of evolution we're talking about when we mention the word is through natural process. Life began as a single cell, and then it changed and made a plant life, and then also made in the animal kingdom an invertebrate, like a jellyfish. And that multicellular invertebrate without blood or skeleton then formed fish somehow. And then the fish evolved or changed through natural process into an amphibian. And the amphibian, through mistakes and chance, formed a reptile through some evolutionary process. And the reptiles formed birds. And then the reptiles also form mammals. Now, the first living cell was, according to the evolutionary theory, founded, and then everything was built up essentially by mistakes. We'll get into that later, called mutations. But everything else was built by accidents all the way up to mankind. So when this author says in the last 2,400 years there's not been a single argument for the existence of God, the implication is that the atheistic argument for the origin of the big three has been compelling and persuasive. Well, let's talk to this gentleman and how the world's most notorious atheist changed his mind. Anthony Flew, for 54 years, was a world-famous atheist. Here he is in 1950. He debated C.S. Lewis back then. He wrote 35 books. Does God exist? He said no. How to Think Straight. Sorry to disappoint you, I'm an atheist. However, in 2004, he publicly came out and says he now believes in God based on scientific evidence. He's concluded that some sort of intelligence or first cause must have, and he addresses the big three: the origin of the universe, it's the only good explanation for the origin of life, and the complexity of nature, which means evolutionary, as it builds more complex creatures. He also published 4 years later a book, There Is a God, and how he changed his mind. Dean Kenyon wrote the college textbook in the 70s on the origin of life textbook. He since has criticized his own theory, believed it was scientifically impossible, and now believes there must be a supernatural creator. The number of atheists that have switched to creationists is quite a large list. And when you make that switch, you're basing that on evidence that they believed was conclusive and compelling, not just probably true. Some of these people, C.S. Lewis, Lee Strobel's, many of these are also professors at universities that taught evolution. This is just a handful of atheists that are now creationists. And when PBS in 2001 had a program on evolution and they stated all known scientific evidence supports Darwinian evolution, as does virtually every reputable scientist in the world, that so angered the other side of scientists that had strong doubts about it, that a full-page ad was taken out of the New York Times indicating that they are skeptical of the ability of evolution to produce this. This list now constitutes 900 scientists. Most are professors with PhDs in major universities. So the areas I'm going to focus on, I don't have time. It's a totally different presentation on the origin of the universe, but we are going to focus on, in this three-part series, the origin of life and Darwinian evolution. Let's start with the origin of life. What is the difference between non-living things and living things? Non-living things are stars, rocks, dirt, water, gas. Nothing alive in them. They exist. Living things are animals, plants, trees, and bacteria. So what's the difference between non-living things versus living things? The answer is living things are made up of complex cells built by complex information. Non-living things are not. Now, the single cell is not simple. A living cell is a marvel of detailed and complex architecture, in the Encyclopedia Britannica online. The consensus is the most elementary type of living cell has precise engineering that is unimaginable unimaginably more complex than any machine yet thought of, let alone constructed by mankind. Franklin Harold, who is an evolutionist, in his book The Way of the Cell, stated even the simplest cells are more ingeniously complicated than man's most elaborate inventions. That includes computers and the space shuttle. He went on to say, we must concede that there are no detailed Darwinian accounts of the evolution of any biochemical system, only a variety of wishful speculations. In the single cell, there are thousands of biochemical systems and machinery that we will get into. The cell is functionally as complex as a small city. Multiple parts functioning in close coordination with one another. Cells are also high-tech factories, and at the microscopic level you will find it's composed of artificial languages and decoding systems, proofreading with quality control mechanisms that safeguard against errors, precision control systems that regulate the automatic assembly of components like in a factory, and complete replication system that duplicates the cell, allowing reproduction at incredible speeds. All living things, whether it's a bacteria or a human being, are made up of complex cells. Inside every cell is information that determines how it is built. And this is key. There are no changes to living things unless there is first a change in its information. That concludes part 1. In part 2, the next video, we'll go inside the cell and understand how information builds the structures of life. This is important knowledge to fully assess the claims of evolution. In part 3, we're going to focus on how evolution is supposed to work and why it doesn't have the ability to do what it is credited with doing. We will also be examining false statements inside high school biology books.